Eric.
Omar.
That was me actually just inhaling and then exhaling because I'm bulking right now. That wasn't me actually being pensive. It is just once I exceed 2,400 calories, most people would be thrilled at the prospect of ingesting basically as much food as they want until the satiety signals kick in. Not I. Once it goes to 2,401, pain.
Yeah, I'm different boat. I'm in that end stage recovery phase personally,
Yep.
where the gaining is coming a little easy on 25 to 2,600 calories. I'm still that's putting me at about maybe a little over a pound a month gains right now, which doesn't exactly make sense on paper for my activity levels and body weight, but that's kind of that end stage recovery. And the good news, gains look pretty lean. The bad news is I could always eat a little bit more. And things taste a little too tasty. So you can tell there's just a little more contest prep recovery to go for me. But hey, this weekend, I think I'm 11 weeks post-show. So I think I've got another, probably 1 to 3 weeks before I feel like I'll be fully, I'll say we're back.
Yeah.
And I'll mean it. Probably.
We are so back. Well, Eric, I focus only on the superficial assessment, so I don't care about your feelings. And I'll say that you look great. So don't change anything. Of course, if once again the hunger persists and there's other potentially deleterious effects, I don't want to hear about it. Just how you look right now, Eric, you look great. So just focus on, you know how you say it's all about the process, it's all about that. Look at those biceps. I don't care. You look great. Don't change it. Let it fester. Whatever. This lingering feeling of oh my God, I'm hungrier than I should be. We don't care.
Nothing feels as bad as being lean is feeling good. Or what's the saying? Nothing is as bad. Nothing's easier. Don't throw glass stones when you're in a brick house. That's what they say.
Yeah, that is or she's a brick house, something like that. It's all related.
Two stones in the bush are worth one in the hand, and you shouldn't throw them in glass houses.
Something about birds, 2 stone, 1
2 birds,
forest, trees. Yeah,
glass stones.
So we have a power hour. We would like to introduce a new segment for Iron Culture to Iron Cult listeners, not because we both only have 1 hour, and we are damn near making it happen. Eric was traveling. We have things coming up. Things are thanging, and we are now united. It is my Friday night. It is Eric's Saturday. Where we're united here to deliver this power hour, a duo, okay? This is a nostalgic duo. I actually want to quickly, Eric, speaking of which, we have the topic today. I do want to give some respect to the Iron Cold listeners. I don't think we've read a review for the last several weeks. We have 5. I'll only read 2 to 3 just to make sure we have enough time. I want to give respect to everyone that takes the time. It is on iTunes. That's where they aggregate it. That's where we read it. But a lot of them have kind of, deep hidden lore references. I also want to give a shout out, which is funny, Eric. By the time he hears this, it'll be months later, to someone actually at Fortis, Hamza, he's a strength coach, and he started listening, but he's now all the way up to episode. He said he started listening a few weeks ago, and maybe some other people can relate in the comment section. Started listening a few weeks ago, and he's like, I got to start just the way he works. I have to start at episode 1. So he's at episode 40 something right now. So if we just calculate that, we build it out. So times 5, few weeks, okay, whatever. Within by the halfway point of this year, he will hear this. But that's for you. Shout out to Hamza and all the people that listen and all the references. So Eric, let me have you react. I will pick just a few. I'll skip that one just because there's a great one. Shout out to Trex, who's not here right now. I really want to read that one in his presence because it's related to him. Okay, so this is a pertinent one for us right now. The Super Duo 5 stars by Michael in Norway. I also want to say that these reviews now that I have the proper website, it's not just North America. So if you leave it worldwide, and I do think taking a look at our Libsyn statistics, over, I would say 30 to 40% of our audience is outside of North America. So Europe, around the world, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, everywhere. So the Super Duo from Norway, 5 stars. Omar and Eric are a fantastic duo who brings many great guests to the podcast. Even though not all episodes fit my interests. They have such a good variety of topics and themes. This is a podcast with many interesting discussions and gives the listeners different perspectives of the discussed topic. It's impossible to not love this podcast if you're into lifting and or science. Keep up the good work, fellas.
I'm so mad at that review. What a negative review. Not every single topic is something I'm interested in. If I don't feel like I haven't been slapped in the face by that review, then I don't know what reality is. That's probably the most offensive thing I've heard in my entire life, Omar.
Yeah.
Now, maybe I'm being overly focused on the negative. I don't know about you.
Yeah.
But I felt like that's one of the most offensive things I've ever heard in my life.
I feel like throwing a brick at a glass house. I feel like throwing the baby out with the bathwater right now, if I'm being honest.
You don't throw baby birds out of glass houses when you have 2 stones. I tell you what, that's just what people say. No, but in all seriousness, I love it. Like it's interesting when you think about iron culture, where we are attempting to unite a lot of different quote unquote tribes in the fitness industry and cover everything from Highland Games to documentaries on street workouts to physical culture history in the vaudeville era, to the current landscape of new divisions from 2012 onward and enhanced bodybuilding to, Olympic lifting. Of course, people aren't going to appreciate every single episode. And I think we talked about this. I can't remember if it was on camera or off, but if we just became complete algorithm slaves and looked at like which episodes got the most views and just did like hypertrophy roundtables and controversial topics in strength and health and fitness, it would become like the tail wagging the dog. We might end up basically subverting our own mission statement, but getting, more views or likes on an individual podcast. Then we look up one day and we go, why are we doing this? So no, I think that's a very apt review. And it's really encouraging to me that even though this is someone who doesn't like every single episode, they think the podcast is great, because that's the likelihood of potentially bringing them in and drawing larger circles instead of borders. Am I right, Omar?
Why are you negatively internalizing a very positive review? You're like, Michael said he doesn't listen, or even if every single episode, like, Eric, it's a positive review.
Listen,
let's move on.
I'm retiring. I have been ineffective in my entire life purpose.
Hey man, I think I need to just take a few weeks off. I said, what, did someone leave an actual negative review? You're like, no, it's
not besides that one we already got. Yeah.
Oh, you mean more negative than the catastrophic one you read on the air? Omar, you should actually read these before you read them out loud. That way, save us the pain.
Protect my mental health, yeah.
No, so I do want to read 2 more only because I'm saving the one for Trex for later, and then there's another good one. There's a short one and a longer one, but again, just give respect to everyone. This is from Tony the Roofer in the United States, okay? Left January 22nd. Informative, but at what cost? 5 stars. The Iron Culture Podcast.
I already like it.
Armed with the holy trinity of fitness, OEE offers practical, digestible information with a high-protein digesting lifting index. Truly one of the podcasts of all time. A gestalt union of incredible minds. Yo.
Gestalt.
Look at that.
Oh.
We're greater than the sum of our parts. If that's not what it means, don't correct me. Just go with it. Can we make that the canon?
All right, that's fine. Gestalt means greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
That's totally fine. That's canon. We're stuck together.
Yeah.
I think, see, that's the type of review I like. Just
hey, Siri, what does gestalt mean? Shot in the dark.
It's a seasoning, actually.
Yeah.
It's Gestalt seasoning. It's good.
Yeah. It's German for salt. I get it.
Yeah, it's Gestalt. Could you pass Gestalt? Yeah. So
Eric, that's a positive one, okay? Right? We're back.
Very positive. It was jovial. It met our theme. It pandered to us, and there's nothing that my insecurity can latch onto, folks. That's the example right there. No, but in all seriousness, that's a great review. I love that they are acknowledging the Trinity. I love that Trexler is integrating so well into the iron culture ethos, and it just warms the cookies in my heart.
If you've been playing Iron Culture Bingo, that's one right there. Warms the cookies in his heart. Throw the baby out with the bathwater. Boom. Now this one's a longer one.
Eric, Gestalt in there too, man.
I'm looking. Eric, can you look that up while I read? There's just I don't know. Like, I'm not putting my claim that it's great. I thought it's like some part, like it is greater than the sum of the parts or something like that.
No, you got it right.
Oh, yeah. Is it? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Because imagine it was something completely different, and then the whole interpretation we actually have to look at again, because he did say informative, but at what cost? Which made me pause for a second. I was like,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it might just be that he knows that we're making a deal with Paimon, and he's like,
right.
I haven't seen the negative effects of
Yeah.
that, and neither have we, and we
Yeah.
probably won't until we're burning for eternity. But
Yeah.
YOLO.
Yeah. Yeah.
Except for the afterlife where we're burned forever, but YOLO.
You only live once, and then you live for eternity. But we didn't read the fine print.
That's too long of an acronym.
Yeah. Okay, so the final one right here is I enjoy walking my dog again, and that is by Das JENIGE123 in Germany. We can also ask this individual about, what is German for salt. This is a long one. 5 stars. Oh boy, what a gem have I found. This podcast goes all in on the banter just to make a U-turn and deep dive into the science. Eric's and Omar are incredible in swapping between banter mode and science communication, and the chemistry between all of them makes it the more pleasant to listen to. What I love is that we go deep on the science, but then we always bring it back for the average lifter too. That's where their years-long coaching experience becomes evident. I really love listening to each episode. Sometimes it's awkward when I laugh out of the blue and there's only my dog, myself, with hardly visible headphones, and a stranger now crossing the road. Thank you for your efforts to go into this podcast. I now take my dog on prolonged walks, as that's when I listen to my podcast and I can't get enough. Snickers approves. Very important. P.S. Not 100% on the theme, and maybe this is a segue, which is why I included this one. P.S. Not 100% on theme, but I'd be very curious to hear the crew's thoughts and review of the literature on the healthy at any size movement, especially since past episodes did touch upon eating disorders and the sometimes, in parentheses, unhealthy desire to be overly lean. Not sure if you want to give any commentary on that, Eric, but that was kind of like a softball in case you do, or we revisit it, we go to actual topic today. Boom.
Yeah, actually, no.
Sure, I have nothing to say.
I will take it. You can pass Gestalt over to me, and we'll have a nice spicy discussion on the health at any size movement. I would refer listeners who aren't aware to some of the podcast episodes we have done specifically with Ben House, as well as Gabriel Fondero, as well as Dr. Spencer Nadolski, where we've touched on this topic. And also, actually,
Jake Lenardon.
And Jake Lenardon, yep. Also, people who listened to last week's episode where we had the crossover mass office hours, I would encourage you to listen to the office hours that came out this present week with myself and Dr. Trexler, where we touched upon metabolically healthy obesity. And he talked about some statistics of what is the likelihood, and are there people who are with obesity, however, they also are metabolically healthy, whether it's transient state, and, are there levels of adiposity where that's probably unlikely or not. But I think ultimately the cornerstone of that movement is to say that there are things that you can do to improve your health besides weight loss. And not everyone is in a position who would benefit from weight loss to be able to lose weight. And there are potential costs when you take someone who does not have a healthy relationship with their body or food, who has previously struggled with cyclical dieting phases and regained lost weight and lost self-efficacy and experienced some of the negative effects of that, of trying to have them diet again. And sometimes the best strategy that has the lowest risk of harm and the highest risk of providing benefit would be a weight-neutral approach where you focus on other health processes. Let's get you active. Let's focus on qualitative changes to your diet, not quantitative reductions in energy. Let's think about improving your sleep schedule. Let's focus on mental health. Let's see about getting you out in nature more, improving your social environment, and doing things more akin to life and health coaching rather than, say, weight loss. Even though we could say, okay, objectively, your BMI is in the class 2 or 3 obesity range. You have a lot of central adiposity. You have, pre-diabetic metabolic panel. And we're pretty sure that if you were to lose weight, all those things would improve. However, if that also concurrently comes with potential disordered eating patterns and weight regain that might even overshoot where you start. Is that the best decision right now? It could be something we do in the future, but perhaps the lowest risk of harm, highest risk of benefit would be a weight neutral approach. And I think when you look at least in the less activist and more evidence-based sector of the health at every size movement, that's generally the message, and making sure that there are options for people who are heavier. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. And I think that is probably also the most charitable view of the way to look at it. And I do see there are some critiques of it, and there are some people who present it in a way that is perhaps not in line with what I just stated, and more from an activist and extremist perspective. And I think there probably is some benefits and some issues with that, depending upon how that message is being presented and to whom, and to how factual the science around it is. But ultimately, I think that's the part we want to promote, engage with, and see as the primary part of that movement, because it is the voice that's becoming more and more dominant and accepted in the scientific community and being promoted and integrated into healthcare. And I think, anytime you're seeing an active conflict that has social undertones, that hopefully something positive eventually shakes out of it. And I think that is what is shaking out.
So Eric, not to get into hot button topic, like Omar, I want to present the study that we spoke about before.
No,
this
we're
episode.
good.
But I do wonder, I think it was with Spencer Nadolsky, Dr. Spencer Nadolsky, that we spoke a little bit, but maybe it would be a good idea to discuss at some point in the future, because I do think there's still some confusion, even in the evidence-based, this is me from an outside perspective, evidence-based community, about the new class of weight loss drugs, and either the intention behind it or the whole conversation. Maybe can you give some commentary, Eric, from your perspective, being in the evidence-based space, the general sway of opinions, and I mean opinions truly, not like the body of evidence, but what the kind of either participants, because I do see people like shout out Spencer Nadolsky. I see like Austin Brocky, who's like a doctor of internal medicine, but still nonetheless like what he posts and so on and so forth. With some of the research and once again the new class of weight loss drugs and what they're doing and some of the potential benefit. And then I do see, like, from a few years ago, the notion of some of these weight loss drugs and what would they be used for, and what is the real issue here when it comes to weight gain or people's inability to lose weight. And so there's been a shifting, I'd say, general narrative, and I don't want to give any commentary on that because it's not, one, something that I'm personally very invested in, where I feel like I've digested or absorbed enough to offer any opinion whatsoever. But I will say, from the outside, it certainly seems that what you said at the very end, it is shifting over time. Is that because of mounting new research? Is it because the consensus of opinions out there where, to be honest, some communicators, when it's kind of like adjacent to your expertise and it's something you're like, not superficially aware of, you know what I mean, Eric? But it's something within kind of your wheelhouse, but it's far in that wheelhouse. So you're just waiting for what the let's say the minds, the greater minds of that space say, and then you resort like what's going on overall in the space, like let's say the evidence-based space right now. And we could have another conversation another time. But you brought up some great points. Just final question, then boom, topic.
Absolutely. No, it's a good question, and it's something I'm primarily just an observer on rather than being super informed on it. I've always tried to describe myself as a physique and strength sports scientist with, which intersects a ton with nutrition and physical activity, and weight loss. But I'm not an obesity researcher by any means, nor am I a specialist in, pharmacological interventions for this. So I, like you, am not going to give like my thoughts on the data, because I don't know it well enough, nor the the long-term safety of these drugs, or to really know about their mechanisms beyond kind of a surface level of them being GLP-1 agonists and their name, like semaglutide being one of the most popular ones, and I could tell you the magnitudes of their effect and their seeming safety profile, and the fact that they are almost a monumental leap forward in terms of effectiveness and comparable to things like bariatric surgery. But what I will comment on, beyond that surface level type of deal, is I think it's really interesting the timing of them coming out and the reactions that you see, because it tells you some of the true motivations and emotional responses that people have behind some of these narratives that might seem rational, but I think are actually rooted in bias sometimes. So, for example, you have all of these trainers who have been talking about, the obesity epidemic's a huge issue. You're a burden on the healthcare system. Sometimes they're even neutral or even positive towards things like fat shaming, or just seeing it as a negative or a personal failing that you're overweight, or even at the least kind of toxic, like, you can be a better version of yourself. Like you should change, and you should want to change. And to see those people then actually react negatively to people who are taking these drugs and successfully losing weight. And sometimes I'll point out, and I think there is some data on this, but I wouldn't be well-informed enough to cite it, but certainly anecdotes. Some of the people who are taking these drugs have been able to adhere to a healthy diet and physical activity regimen more consistently. And that's probably a feed-forward effect because they're acting synergistically and they're boosting one another up. The effect of the drug helping them stick to a diet because it's impacting satiety, seeing successful weight loss, liking being in the gym and seeing the changes, feeling more fit. Running on the treadmill, lifting weights is easier, more effective. So what appears to be what they wanted these people to achieve, weight loss and consistency in the gym and the kitchen, now they're not happy with that. And it's like somehow there's a sector of trainers who see like the weight loss drugs is just cheating. Some of it's just from the naturalist fallacy, go to a CrossFit gym and there's trainers who are just like anti anything from the pharmaceutical industry. But sometimes you see trainers who are clearly on the sauce, hating on people who are obese taking weight loss drugs.
Yeah.
And that to me is just a level of cognitive dissonance that, that's funny, right?
Yeah.
It's to the point of like, come on, bro. I think that's one thing. Looping this question back to the Hayes question, health at every size, there are some issues with some of the more extreme messaging around that is not really based in evidence, but more based in, listen, we need any kind of messaging to move the needle so that, people who are overweight are not being, oppressed and there's less weight stigma. And when you have this kind of end goal, rather than I'm going to follow the data, and you have a social justice goal, which I do think we need, don't get me wrong, it doesn't always, you're more willing to look at data in the way that confirms your biases. I will say that. This is the same thing we see when we engage with vegans who are, more willing to, who really think for ethical reasons that people should not be eating animals. And I myself have reduced my animal food intake for ethical reasons. And I understand that the drive to want to see everything as a positive towards a vegetarian or vegan diet. But when someone starts, claiming that you don't need any protein in your diet, or, low protein diets are just as good for building muscle, all that, it's like, well, hold on. We don't have to shift everything towards whatever supports my biases. You can have ethical beliefs around eating animal products, or not eating animal products, I should say, and still go, right, and I need to make some adjustments to my diet for my fitness goals to, cross those T's and dot those I's, because it's a little more challenging, or at least I have to think a little bit more while being on a plant-based diet. So anyway, my point is in the kind of extremist Hayes side of this discussion, some people actually see any weight loss as bad or unhealthy, or at the very least, any intentional weight loss as bad or unhealthy. So you actually have people from a group that was formed because weight loss has not been successful and looking for alternatives, who've taken that so far to now see that there's people with genuine health issues. Someone with type 2 diabetes, who has a large amount of central adiposity, right, is experiencing insulin resistance and is having secondary issues, vascular issues. They're having bone mineral density issues because they can no longer be active because they're overweight, and it's difficult for them to even be physical. And the other option for them is, either bariatric surgery, which might also be seen as bad by these people, or, taking an oral weight loss drug. And I have seen some people who are like, no, these weight loss drugs are bad because it's weight loss. And it's a very black and white view. I can completely understand a Hayes proponent saying, listen, like if you're attempting to lose weight for the 5th time and you've been yo-yo dieting and developing, a binge eating disorder, and you really are losing self-efficacy, and this is a burden on you mentally, emotionally, and physically, and you keep trying to do something that's not successful, we should definitely take a weight neutral approach. That's a completely fine message. But I think that same practitioner would generally say, oh, but you might benefit from weight loss, but it's just not on the table. Oh, if it was on the table from this drug and the benefits were worth the potential risks, and as far as we can see, the side effects are quite low, especially if it's medically supervised and prescribed, they would be all for someone taking one of these GLP-1 agonists like semaglutide, so long as there were no contraindications. Again, this is not medical advice. I have a PhD, not an MD. So I think it's funny that you have kind of these like personal responsibility, sometimes on PED trainer warriors who are like, it's not okay for you to take these weight loss drugs. Let me go, jack up some trend. And then you have these people who are like, hey, it's really challenging to lose weight and we need to look at weight neutral approaches. But no, an easy way to lose weight? No, now weight loss is just bad all around. People who are typically fighting with each other kind of uniting around something for emotional reasons that is counter to the data. And I think it is I think it should be a message of caution to everyone that, yes, there are issues in society. We do need social change. And, we do need people to speak up when there's problems, but we also need to try to continue to engage with the data on things and the research and the empirical information we have so that we don't allow those things to get washed away in the midst of a social movement where we end up doing more harm to the people we're actually trying to help. But what I've heard, Omar, is actually that science is killing your gains. So there's probably no reason to look at that at all and just go with your feelings.
Eric, I was going to remain silent, but I need to stand up. I need to speak up right now. And I just want to say, for those that claim it is not about personal responsibility, I want to bring up one nation, okay? One nation in particular, Japan. Now, I've never been there. The culture is impenetrable to me. The sum of my total knowledge of said culture is Hello Kitty and Dragon Ball Z. Nonetheless, I have it on very good authority that they have McDonald's there. Yet they are a culture, as we know. Again, I've never been there. I have no understanding besides what's been pre-digested for me from via, North American news. That they have a culture of great shame, meaning that if one is to gain weight, you are shamed for that. And that is why their obesity rate is so low, despite having all these delicious food items, having the food availability that we have in North America. So is it really a question of, this obesogenic environment, like yada, 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 is so difficult for people? Or is it really just a question of willpower? And I want to know. I want to know. I'm asking, you asked the semi-soft, tough questions. I'm just going right in there, Eric.
Honestly, you saying that has made me rethink everything.
Thank you.
Your cursory understanding of
Godzilla. Gojira. He's actually 100% muscle. I want to say for the record too.
Yeah, he just has very muscular abs, which you need to control thermonuclear breath.
Thank you.
People, I don't think body shaming is okay.
Yeah.
Just because someone's muscular shape is not what you think it should be. As long as it's a muscular shape.
Yeah.
If it's a different shape, then that's unacceptable. No, Omar, I see what you did there. And I'm glad in satire you're able to point that out, because I do think it's another example where if you want to believe something, a paper-thin pseudo-intellectual argument will seem reasonable to you. And if you don't want to believe something, you'll be like, yeah, but what about X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
And you'll pick it apart to the degree that you're capable. And obviously that's a paper-thin argument that you put up, but it's not one that isn't actually out there and hasn't been said a lot. So yeah, well done,
Eric. I've seen it. Now let us get to the topic du jour. I am going to ask. I just want to say I'm going to see what Trex says. Okay, maybe you listened to the episode, maybe you didn't, but we should say at some point and pass the gestalt and just see what he says, see what he does, and that's going to become a new Iron Culture-ism.
Trexler is fast on his feet.
Yes, and, unfortunately.
You know what? And I've never seen the man get salty. So if we ask him to pass gestalt, we'll see what he does. I think you'll be able to handle that.
Oh, yeah.
He might just nod and carry on and ignore us, which is fine.
Right. So the research, I'm like, oh, okay. So
Yeah.
we're talking about the science now.
The problem is he doesn't respect either one of us.
Yes.
And we've given him no reason to. So he doesn't need to actually respond in a positive way to our banter. He could just carry on and continue to carry the podcast forward while we try to derail it. But yeah, we'll see. If we catch him in a good mood and he's only like moderately annoyed by us, he might decide to play with us.
It just depends on how much non-alcoholic beer he's consumed in that day to put him over the edge, right?
Very true. Very true.
So, Eric, the actual topic today, totally not related to the fact that when I visited you in 2019, to quote Mike Tyson, my back was broken. It was spinal. What's going on?
Yeah, no, this is a pretty cool study that I recently covered in Mass, and I did a brief reel on it just earlier this week when the new Mass issue dropped. And this is one of those studies from the useless field of exercise science that we could have known from the trenches and is hopelessly flawed. And I'm just going to point out how it doesn't tell us anything. Just kidding. That's not the way that works. But this is a really cool study. I saw it, and it's quite interesting because, we've had, like, you did that pain science roundtable, which, was fun to watch. Probably was a little longer than it needed to be. And then we've also had some great guests on. We've had Austin Baraki. We've had what else have we had? We had Quinn Hennock on. We've had Nick Licamelli. We've had a lot of great people talking about what I would describe as a big paradigm shift in musculoskeletal rehab. And evidence-based practice is an interesting thing. I see it kind of come in waves, and it impacts different fields at different times. And me, like I said before, being in kind of the physiques and strength sports science, as working with athletes, I need to be aware of fields that are related but tangential to mine. The basic knowledge I kind of have on what's going on with, the obesity epidemic and ways to treat it and, responses to it and the social movements and the data. Another obviously adjacent area is dealing with injuries. And I've been someone who has had them. I've been someone who's absolutely coached people in the post-rehab period where it, returns to my scope of practice as a coach. I've engaged with people on various spectrums of what I would consider being up-to-date modern evidence-based practitioners in musculoskeletal rehab. Over the course of my whole time lifting, I've seen chiropractors, sports medicine doctors, athletic trainers, physical therapists, physiotherapists down here in New Zealand, and surgeons, unfortunately. So the shift, the paradigm shift that's going on is, and this is an oversimplification, and I think people who lean one way or the other would even consider this an oversimplification, is a shift from what is considered like the biomedical model of pain and injury to what would be described as the biopsychosocial model. So the biomedical model is basically saying that, hey, pain is a result of tissue damage that is sensed by nociceptors, pain receptors. It sends a signal that's interpreted as pain by the brain. And then if you treat the mechanical damage and that goes away, the pain will go away and you'll be good to go. And even more so, especially when you get into physiotherapy, physical therapy, the link between how you move and the mechanical damage is even clearer, right? So we have things like the functional movement screen, the FMS. We have things like posture. We have paradigms, which, you and I were both NASM certified, and they've obviously changed over time, and they're not as dogmatic about this, in my opinion. Like you got to score a certain way, and we have to do a stabilization phase before we can get into muscular endurance, before we get into hypertrophy. And injuries are an outcome of faulty movement patterns or muscular imbalances. If we see, upper cross syndrome or anterior pelvic tilt, it's because you have this muscle group is tight, this muscle group is weak, so you need to stretch that, foam roll that, and you need to resistance train this, right? That paradigm is changing. And because the data doesn't really support these clear, on paper, nice, clean links between movement, injury, pain, injury recovery, cessation of pain, normal movement. Like that's on paper how it's supposed to go in the biomedical model. But And it's not that that can't be what happens. It's not that poor movement can't result in injury that causes mechanical damage that you sense as pain, and that once you resolve that and move differently, it goes away. That absolutely does happen sometimes. The problem is that it also doesn't happen a lot of the time. And when we look at some of the statistical information that's actually been published on this, we really see that start to fall apart. And this is one of those really important topics where without data, without actually researching it, it's super challenging to change this narrative. And we see the effects in the trenches, if you will. Just go to the comment section of anyone deadlifting with even the slightest bit of rounding anywhere in their back. And it's like, oh my God, I can't believe you didn't explode on camera today, right now. And if you didn't, you probably will tomorrow. And if you don't tomorrow, well, guess what? When you're my age, doesn't matter that you're older than me, you're going to be feeling that pain and you're going to pay for those. And that way I can always be right, because if you get injured 10 years from now, I can say it was on that video that I commented on back in 2013, right? So we see that with squats, knees over toes. We see that with upright rows. We see it with back rounding. I get it all the time, like there's a very specific technique you need to have. And that is kind of connected to the whole idea of movement screens, right? So the biopsychosocial model, on the other hand, acknowledges a few things that are evidence-based, that, hey, we can have pain and not have any apparent mechanical reason for it. There's actually a great review, if anyone wants to kind of get an idea on this paradigm shift. There's a review titled Management of Chronic Musculoskeletal Pain Through a Biopsychosocial Lens by Pomerensky, and that came out in 2022, so pretty recent, and that's in the Journal of Athletic Training. So this is read by athletic trainers, and it is a narrative review, open access, that you can read. Kai will have that in the notes, and it talks about the kind of this paradigm shift and why. And some of the data they cite, for example, is that you can have people with chronic lower back pain who have no apparent issues on any imaging technique, and there is no mechanical source of their pain. Likewise, you can take people who are completely asymptomatic and you can do some scans and you can find out that they have multiple slip discs. And you can also see that sometimes in certain types of surgeries for certain issues, the recovery rates and the success rates are no different than not actually getting the surgery at all. And a phenomenon called regression to the mean, which just means that our bodies naturally heal as best as they can. So you might get surgery and then report being better, let's say 6 months later. But when we take a control group who did not get surgery but had the same symptoms 6 months later, if they're reporting a similar level of quote unquote getting better, did that surgery really help you? And that's surgery specific, but unfortunately that happens a lot. And there is a great meta-analysis that was done in 2014 by Camper and colleagues titled Multidisciplinary Biopsychosocial Rehabilitation for Chronic Lower Back Pain, where they found that treatments that tried to leverage the biopsychosocial approach outperformed usual treatments such as surgery or like traditional kind of physical therapy based on a pure biomedical model. So not only is there these disconnections when we take a pure biomedical lens and we try to look at pain and injury being related, but there's also data saying, okay, when we try to use a more biopsychosocial approach, which I'll explain what that is in a minute, it's more successful. And the biopsychosocial model basically acknowledges that pain is an experience, and it is impacted by various things. So if you have had chronic pain for a long time, it's something that changes your motor patterns. It changes your view of yourself. It can become ingrained in your identity. You can have fear around certain movements or activities that initially led to the pain or caused by it. It can impact your life in ways that change you substantially. You might have to change jobs. You might lose the ability to, say, play with your grandkids or to drive in some cases. You can't be seated for that long. And that can have an impact on various things. Moreover, we have a lot more kind of just pure neuroscience information. Like when you see the color red versus blue, you're more likely to report higher pain, like stuff like that, and obviously I need to give more context for that to make sense, but you can give someone like a mild shock and show them a red light versus a blue light, and they'll feel more pain when it's red. So there's a lot of things that impact you. Having poor sleep you can feel more fatigue and pain despite the actual physical injury and tissue damage being the same. So the point is that your treatment should take into consideration your social environment, biology. Yes, that's the bio part. It's the start of the word. Your psychology around it, and the individual characteristics, and even things like your socioeconomic status, and other access to resources and care, because all of those things are going to impact recovery and the experience of injury and whether or not it fully recovers. And sometimes the narratives around pain are just not very useful. The idea that pain is something that is bad in all cases, should be fully avoided, and can be suppressed and removed from life are actually relatively modern considerations. And some of it actually came from the opiate crisis. Some of the big companies that were pushing opiates and, getting them approved without arguably the proper things in place and even some corruption, they started a huge push and drive to influence the medical industry starting in the 90s in North America to really paint pain as something that is always a bad thing, should be quantitatively measured, and that we should be prescribing things to make it go away, and that the goal is to get all patients pain-free. Prior to that, that narrative wasn't as strong, and now the narrative is kind of coming back to where it should be, and things like saying, okay, well, even if your pain stays the same, but we're able to improve your movement or get it back to where it was, or improve your performance. Like, hey, if you were deadlifting 300 at a pain of, 3 out of 10, now you're deadlifting 400 at a pain of 3 out of 10, that's a win. Instead of just, the only goal is to make all pain go away. Also, should we be always asking people 0 to 10, what's your pain? 0 to 10, what's your pain? Is getting people to focus on it and quantify it, is that always helpful? So all these conversations are happening, and what we're seeing is a big shift, and moving a little bit away from these clear connections between movement and injury. And the current study that I want to talk about is a great example of how the clear connections that we wish there were are not always there. So the study that I want to talk about is specifically in powerlifters. It's titled Lumbopelvic Movement Control in Powerlifters with and Without Lower Back Pain by Larson and colleagues. And this study just came out at the end of last year in 2023. And what they did is they took a group of powerlifters and they basically screened them, and they separated into those who had lower back pain and those who did not have lower back pain. And these were Swedish powerlifters, if I recall correctly. And they had to report back pain. They had to report it for a certain amount of time. And they also had to have they had to be actually registered with the Swedish Powerlifting Association, which I think in Sweden means they've actually had to have competed. But these are pretty strong people. When you look at the actual bench press, squats, and deadlifts, taking into account that these are men and women across multiple weight classes, you've got the powerlifters with lower back pain squatting around 160 kilos on average, benching around 112, and deadlifting around 200. And those without lower back pain squatting around 170, benching around 120, and also deadlifting around 200. No significant differences between them at baseline. And these folks have been training for 8 to 9 years on average, competing for around 3 to 4 years on average. And they've done 2 comps on average in the last 12 months, and they're training 4 to 6 times a week. So these are competitive powerlifters, are legitimate, very, very serious athletes lifting heavy weights. So they had to report that they had lower back pain, and they screened them for this. And then what they did was they gave them a 7-part lumbopelvic movement control test. So it consisted of movements like bending over while trying to keep your lower back straight, doing a seated unilateral leg extension and leg curl on your seated, and then in the prone position to see if you can keep a neutral spine, seeing if you can just posteriorly tilt without actually shifting your back position. Can you stand on one leg without seeing a huge lateral shift? And then quadruped rocking backward and forward while keeping a neutral spine. So these 7 tests were scored to see basically how well could you control your lumbar in keeping it neutral while doing these movements. And then if you could not control the lumbar and keep it neutral, which they assessed, then you scored positive, okay, you don't have lumbopelvic control. And they wanted to see whether there was different scores between the powerlifters with lower back pain and without. Now, the reason they performed this series of tests was because in the general population, these tests did discriminate between individuals with lumbar pain. And this was actually a study done by, and I might be mispronouncing this, lumbopelvic. That's apologies, I'm mispronouncing that, but it's Lumajoki, done back in 2008. Movement control tests of the low back, evaluation of the difference between patients with low back pain and healthy controls. Now, this same testing battery given to people in the general population, not athletes, and they found some pretty substantial differences. Not only were those with lower back pain having more positive scores, meaning they had poor lumbopelvic control than those without, but also those with chronic lower back pain had poorer scores or less lumbopelvic control than people with acute and subacute, so less than 12 weeks of having pain, or I think 12 to 16 weeks. So this test has actually discriminated in the general population between people with pain and without. So, like I said, there's some things that are, connected, like pain and movement in some cases. So they thought, okay, since this worked in the general population, let's apply it to powerlifters and see what we get. And the interesting thing was there was no significant difference and really no meaningful difference. And there wasn't anything that really popped on this test. And they did not meet their hypothesis in powerlifters. The powerlifters had very similar total scores on the movement test. And their specific hypothesis was that they expected the powerlifters with lower back pain to have poor lumbopelvic control, and that they would specifically have poor lumbopelvic control in the specific tests related to flexion control. So like the waiter's test, right? And that actually just didn't pan out. We didn't see any significant differences. So we have to think like, okay, what does that mean, right? Well, if we go all the way back to the general population, seeing that people with chronic pain are, not moving the same and have poor lumbopelvic control compared to those with subacute pain, and people with and acute lower back pain, and people with pain generally are moving poorer than people without pain. What does that mean? I think the knee-jerk response, and the response that would be great if you were a practitioner, is that, the people who move poorly are more likely to be hurt and therefore have pain. So I have a role as a trainer or a physiotherapist. If I can improve their movement, they're less likely to get hurt and experience pain. That would be a nice 1-2 punch, right? But the reality is that this is a cross-sectional analysis. Do you have pain? Let's score you, and let's compare some things. It's not causational. We're not determining the chicken or the egg here. I think it's far more likely that someone got injured or has pain for whatever reason. There may not even be tissue damage, and then they're moving differently. I mean, you and I have both had lower back pain, and we've gotten out of chairs, we've sat down, we've done moss wrestling, we've done things that really don't make sense. And moving different is kind of par for the course. Am I right, Omar?
100%.
Yeah. And I think the data, this is not, direct data, but I would say it's indirect support. The fact that Lumajoki found that those with chronic lower back pain, had poorer control of the lumbar compared to those with subacute and acute pain, probably indicates that the more time you're spending in this painful reality, the more your movement alters, So again, we can't know that for sure. It could be that, the bad movement is more likely to cause chronic pain than subacute pain. But, we would need a different design. But it's almost impossible with the current abilities we have to do this type of research to really determine cause and effect. You need a huge sample of powerlifters, and you need to watch them prospectively over time to see when they got hurt, testing their movement all the way through. And then seeing, okay, was there a higher likelihood, a higher odds ratio for the people who move poorly to get hurt? Then we could actually make some claims about this. So we would like it to be that when we see someone with poor movement, it predicts injury, but we just don't have that data. And I'm not saying absence of evidence is evidence of absence or vice versa, but we can't know that. And I think it's probably more likely that we're seeing a chicken, not an egg scenario here, if you will, which means that I think once a powerlifter has lower back pain, they're going to be moving a little differently, but perhaps not in these non-sport specific tests. So here's an interesting thing. It worked in the general population. We could see the connection between pain and movement. Didn't work in the powerlifters. Why is that? Well, other research in different types of athletes has actually found some interesting things. So there is an interesting study that was done by Wayrock and colleagues, the association between rotation-related impairments and activity type in people with and without lower back pain. And what they did is they provided a movement screen that was all based around lumbopelvic control during rotation. And they took rotational athletes, so like throwers, tennis players, people who did a lot of rotating, golfers, etc. And they found that the rotational athletes with and without lower back pain had poor lumbopelvic control than the general population without lower back pain, meaning that just participating in a sport altered their movement patterns and made them look like they moved poorer than the general population. Now, poor lumbopelvic control is kind of an artificial construct when you think about it. So what I think we're actually seeing here is that a rotational athlete is moving in a way that's supporting their performance. And there may be some lumbar movement, and that might be helpful during rotational sports. And they move differently than someone who doesn't participate in sports. And that makes sense. Anytime you do movement screening of athletes, you're going to see sport-specific adaptations in their movement and range of motion. We've observed that in powerlifters. Dr. Alyssa Joy Spence, who's been on the podcast with Milo Wolf, for her PhD, she did some range of motion assessments in both male and female nationally qualified New Zealand powerlifters. And among the men specifically, she found that they had less hip and shoulder range of motion than resistance-trained men who weren't powerlifters, but that was associated with being stronger. So those who had less range of motion were actually stronger. So this is what a traditional kind of physiotherapist would go, that's a negative adaptation. You have less range of motion. But it's actually a sport-specific adaptation that's helping them. So I think the narrative around what is good and bad movement is far too general sometimes. More range of motion is not always better. A neutral spine maintenance in all situations may not be better if your goal is to, say, produce rotational force. It seems like these rotational athletes, who I betcha can produce more rotational force and power than the general population, are moving differently. That may just be a functional adaptation, and it doesn't seem to discriminate between whether they have back pain or not, right? So perhaps if we were to do another study in powerlifters and we did want to see what was related to pain, we would need a more sport-specific test. And that's another thing that Wayrock found, was that when they looked specifically at limb motion during rotation, there was a difference between lumbopelvic control and athletes, rotational athletes, who had back pain or didn't. But that was a very specific test, and that kind of makes sense, The more sport-specific the test, rotating while moving a limb, which is going to happen in all the sports where you think about it. Oh, now you don't have lumbopelvic control, and that actually is associated with who has back pain and who isn't. It discriminates in those athletes. Interesting. So that makes me think, okay, well, maybe if we had a screen where it was loaded, or we just looked at training footage, like, bending over at the waist, holding nothing in your hand for a powerlifter, may be pretty easy to maintain lumbopelvic control. Can you do it with 80% of your 1RM, Or can you do it under fatigue? Like, what if we took training footage of powerlifters and we looked at their reps at a 7 RPE and higher? Are they actually having, lumbopelvic control? And does that discriminate? Or, so under fatigue, heavier loads in competition and in training, it'd be interesting to look at their lumbopelvic control during sport-specific movements. And if there was a difference, that wouldn't surprise me. And in fact, that would support the notion that you need more sport-specific tests or just population-specific tests if you want to discriminate and find the connection between movement and pain. But unfortunately, it still comes back to what do we do with this information? Like, even if we did find a powerlifting sport-specific test where we could discriminate between powerlifters with and without pain, if it is actually the movement being caused by the pain, then it doesn't tell us anything new. Like, you come to the doctor's office, you go, oh, my back hurts, and go, let me do a movement screen. Yeah, it looks like your back hurts based upon this movement screen. Thanks. So what do I do about it? I don't know. I just wanted to tell you that you were right. So it's not helpful. What we really need to move forward is to do like time series and look at people during the rehabilitation period with a sport-specific test and see if there is a change over time. Maybe, and this is very speculative, your ability to move comes back, earlier than the actual pain subsides. And you can say, oh, we can have an earlier return to sport or return to heavier training, not just based upon your pain scores or your pain sensation, which could be subjective, but maybe based upon how you're moving. Like if we see, oh, you can actually do these movements and you're doing them the way we think is ideal, but you're still experiencing pain, maybe that's an indication, perhaps highly speculative, that we can, make a different decision as far as your time course of returning to sport or training. I don't know. But nonetheless, I think the take home from this is that the connections between pain and injury recovery, and what is the chicken or the egg is really murky, unclear. It changes depending upon the context. And anytime you hear someone preaching that you really need to fix your posture, upper cross syndrome, anterior pelvic tilt, or hey, you really can't let your lumbar round at all during a squat or a deadlift, or this exercise is bad because these movements will cause injury, will cause pain. Or someone is saying, hey, we need to do a single leg squat test or a functional movement screen or a movement competency test. You have to really question any narrative that claims to have clear diagnostic ability with these. Are they even reliable tests? That's another question. This one happens to be, but not all of them are or even been tested that way. A tangential area of research, the FMS screen is performed pretty poorly as a way of screening athletes for like injury risk, and there has been some research on that. And I think that's probably going to be true of most movement screens, and even more so when they're less sports specific. So the take-home message here is that essentially be skeptical anytime you run into a person preaching that there are universally accepted techniques or ways of moving that are going to reduce your risk of injury or pain. It's just far too simple of a way of viewing the world. And it's not just wrong, it's actually risky. There is a risk of psychological harm, like noceboing somebody, and it can potentially reduce your injury and even slow your return to sport. If you think you have to move in this very narrow kind of envelope of function, and you think like, oh, if I'm outside of that, I'm going to get hurt again, or I'm going to, step backwards in my recovery, that's not a good thing. And I think that can actually slow your ability to come back and have a healthy recovery. And I think we just need to remember like just how amazing the human body is, and that we see people in extreme end ranges of motion at high velocities or high loads, winning championships. And that's like the highest level athletes. It's not this kind of, balancing in this narrow kind of fragile state. No, I have to do it just right or I'm going to break. And that's not what gets gold medals, and it's not what's inspirational. And it's also just not a realistic view. There are times when you're going to have a narrow window of function and ability to move. But you really need to be understanding that you can get back to and having a hopeful optimism towards being able to move and at high velocities with high loads in various ways. And that if you just do that in a gradual way, progressing towards that in kind of a stepwise fashion where you're not trying to, overload too much, you're not increasing range of motion too much all at once, that you can't get back to where you were. So anyway, I thought that was a pretty cool study. It's pretty rare that you get to see like these kind of movement screens specifically in powerlifters. And big shout out to the authors, Larson and colleagues. They commented on my reel on Instagram, and it was like, hey, thanks for a great interpretation of our study. So I didn't get it too wrong, but that was only 1:30. Now I've talked for 30 minutes on it. So hopefully I've got something wrong this time and we can get some hate mail.
Folks, that has been the Power Hour, the first official one of Iron Culture. We're coming in just at the 1 hour mark. As Eric said, be skeptical, and let's extend that. Be skeptical of science. Is science killing your gains? And just remember the now infamous documentary Roadhouse, What Dalton Said, Pain Don't Hurt Much. All these pencil necks are just trying to convince you there's something wrong with you. If you want to hit that PR, it's time to PR or ER. Eric, any closing thoughts on things, very briefly, that you would like to see done? Where you said further research, even if it was done and you said that, but like, what would be an area of interest for you related to specifically, let's say, powerlifters, either their movement as not necessarily a predictor of injury, but anything within this realm? Like, what would be the best case scenario, like a cool study or more research you want to see?
Yeah, I would be very interested to see if like more powerlifting specific tests could discriminate between powerlifters with and without lower back pain. The lowest p-value out of all 7 tests was the waiter's bow rather. And that is basically like an RDL with nothing in your hands. And that was like a 0.15 p-value. And when you kind of look at the data, maybe with a larger sample size, that could have been difference between 2 groups, which gives me a hint that perhaps more specific testing could have discriminated. But then again, like, what do you do with that? But I think it'd be really interesting to see if like clinical assessments, like unloaded or body weight tests, have any relationship to competition or training technique. So in other words, do powerlifters with less lumbopelvic control in clinic also display less lumbopelvic control when squatting and deadlifting and training or competition? And I think that would be more helpful just to know that, because that's a starting point. That wouldn't answer the chicken or egg question, but it would get us a little bit more. And I would also think it'd be pretty cool just to look at training footage. And this would get around like the sample size need of getting, 30, 40 athletes in the clinic with you. Like if you had all of them record themselves from an angle where you could assess with, 2D motion capture their position of their lower back when they're training, when they're doing squats and deadlifts to high RPEs or with heavy loads. And then would that be sufficient to not even necessarily need to do a movement screen to tell you something and see if there's an association with pain? Ask them, what is your pain right now? What was it before training? What was it after training? What was it 2 days later? And then see if there's a relationship between, changes in their lumbopelvic position during training or competition and their pain. I think that would be a much clearer link. Like if, this person's spine moved a lot during their deadlift session, and then they said they were in more pain afterwards, and we saw it as a consistent pattern, then okay, maybe the guy in the comments is right, But I wouldn't expect that to actually be what occurs, but I think that is possible, and I think we could potentially, do a study like that. And with modern, like you'd have to instruct people on how to set the video up the right way, but if you could establish the reliability, have someone in person who's actually using like a goniometer and a clinical assessment to assess neutral spine, and then seeing how well could they do that looking at video. If you could get a decent reliability, then you can get pre-post training session pain scores and also look at, how much movement did they have in their spine, and you do that with like 100 athletes. Now we're talking. Now we're actually potentially getting somewhere. I think that'd be pretty interesting.
Fantastic. Folks, if you've enjoyed this Power Hour, you made it all the way to the end for the 4 of you on YouTube, just put hashtag Power Hour. We'll consider maybe in the future. I will make sure I screen, speaking of which, even 5-star reviews. Even 5-star reviews can set some of the hosts off, right? Where it's seemingly positive and someone can say something, as innocent as not every episode's necessary for me, the topic, and it could create a spiral. But we're here to save ourselves from that, and that is why we dedicate ourselves to Paimon. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review. 5 stars at this point, I've learned, folks, it doesn't cut it. Every single word you choose needs to be positive towards iron culture. That is not a recommendation. That's just an observation of what seems to be digested the best around here. So go ahead and leave a rating review on iTunes. We're back every single insert date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode. Until next time.